Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about noir. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's show, we're talking about the noir class that our good friend Will Scheibel is teaching this summer. Mm-hmm. So, Will, thanks for coming on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
Last time we were talking about Nicholas Ray, and you're writing your dissertation on him.
Exactly.
So how's that going?
Well, I finished my introduction, so I have 4 big chapters left and a conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to think about that right now.
Sure.
The noir class is about all I can handle for these 6 weeks. So
excellent. All right. So let's talk about this noir class that you have developed, Will. So there's a lot of interesting movies on this list, and I want to talk about them. Some of them I've heard, most of them I've heard of. Some of them I've seen. Some of them I have no idea what they are. But but just tell me about what was your goal, creating the class? What were you hoping students pick up on, and how did you choose the movies?
Well, basically, after the PhD candidates defend their prospectus, they have an opportunity to develop a class from scratch. And it's usually something that's tied in with their research interests. And so I've been interested in film noir for as long as I can remember. So as soon as I had that opportunity, I thought, well, here I can do my dream class on noir. And I know that a lot of students have taken noir classes either at IU or elsewhere. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. And so I thought rather than doing just a class on film noir where we're kind of moving through the canonical titles and directors and kind of aesthetics, I took a sort of multimedia approach, and I'm doing film noir and then what I'm calling noir cultures. And I'm doing these noir cultures in the second half of the course, and we're just starting that stuff now. So the first 3 weeks, well, 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks really, is on film noir proper. And we're reading the classic French essays translated into English, the first essays that use the term film noir in relationship to Hollywood movies. And then some of the British and American essays that were published in the late 60s and early 70s that kind of picked up the term and kind of extended it in different directions. And then, kind of a crash course on the must-see kind of noir films from the early to mid-40s. So Maltese Falcon, Double Indemnity, Murder, My Sweet. And then from there, once we've kind of got a handle on the discourses, the major discourses surrounding film noir, I wanted to kind of push on the term and apply some critical pressure to this concept to really see how far it travels beyond film. And so they'll have a sense of the intellectual history of this concept and the ways in which we talk about it in terms of certain aesthetic features, but also really kind of push the boundaries to think about, well, what is it? I mean, some critics call it a genre, some critics call it a style.
Yeah, well, I mean, Paul Schrader says it's not any of those things.
Exactly.
It's just an era.
Exactly.
It's just an era that existed, and it has a beginning and an end date, and after that, it's no more noir.
Exactly.
But
and we read his famous piece, and we're reading. I know Jim Naremore's been on the show a couple of times. We're reading his book, and he's one that really kind of takes us to the edges of the concept and says it's actually an idea that travels.
I've got that book. I've tried to read it. It's way over my head. I cannot get that book. But yeah, okay. So this is interesting. So I'm looking at this list of movies that you sent us, and now a lot of these are sure, of course, most of these are from the 40s.
Right.
A few of these are more recent, but one in particular I've never thought of as a noir, and it's one of my favorite movies. And I'm wondering if you can explain to me what makes this a noir in your eyes. Mulholland Drive. Now it's definitely creepy. It definitely has some of those sort of seedy underbelly kind of things, but I've never thought of it as a noir. So,
well, I'm glad to hear it's one of your favorite movies. It's one of my favorite movies as well. I'm not sure if my students liked it or not. They were a little bit cagey with their responses the day after, but it's one that you have to kind of let sink in and kind of watch several times, I think. There's that chapter in Jim Naremore's More Than Night that talks about Mulholland Drive as a neo-noir, a 21st century noir. And that's, I guess, what kind of got me thinking about, well, if I had to pick a film from the last 10, 15 years that he seems to make a kind of convincing case there. And so I guess how I framed that is a movie very much about movies in that it's literally about filmmakers and stars and that sort of thing. But it's drawing on the iconography of noir. The femme fatale, there's the scene early on where Rita/Camilla looks at the poster of Gilda when she's in the shower and says, when Naomi Watts says, "Oh, what's your name?" And she says Rita. And so she's sort of adopting the kind of persona of a femme fatale.
Yeah.
I mean, and the name there too with Rita Hayworth as Gilda. And so you have the gangster, the kind of shadowy gangster figures, and the film never quite sorts out what their role is, and I don't want to give too much away for people that haven't seen it. But it's an incredibly surreal film. It's nonlinear. So one of the arguments that I made to my students in the class is, in some ways, the sort of master key is the iconography of film noir in our popular and kind of cultural memory of noir as a body of films. And that, depending on how you read what exactly is happening in the narrative, Naomi Watts' character, Betty, as it is in the first half of the movie, and then Diane in the second half. If you read, as a lot of critics do, as Jim does, you read that sort of first 2 hours as a dream or some kind of wish-fulfilling fantasy. She has sort of rewritten the events of her life as a movie and gives it, that kind of Hollywood spin. I mean, it's set in Hollywood, but she's also the kind of detective in her own noir film. She's this sort of Girl Scout, kind of Nancy Drew type who's solving this mystery. And so, you've got the stolen money, you've got the guns, you've got, a lot of these familiar archetypes, and that, the film in some ways is kind of reflecting or meditating on the way these images and these ideas that we associate with noir kind of are filtered throughout popular culture, and that in some ways we make sense of things with narratives that are familiar to us from Hollywood. And of course it's an anti-Hollywood film in many ways. It's a critique on the industry.
So there's another film in here that I think if most people thought about it, they'd realize it is a noir, but it's more of a sci-fi noir.
Right.
Tech noir, some would say.
Yeah, tech noir, yeah.
Blade Runner.
Exactly.
Which, again, we just talked about Ridley Scott, and he's kind of going back. Alien could maybe sort of a little bit, at least in the filming style.
Yeah.
The darkness.
Some of the low-key stuff.
But Blade Runner is like pure noir. That's the whole thing. So I mean, is it just obvious that one had to be there? Was that one that you had to think about?
Well, I love the movie, so any excuse to show Blade Runner, is good enough for me. So I wanted to also show them that there are these noir aesthetics in other genres. So you could have like westerns that draw from film noir. You could have comedies or spoofs or kind of pastiche films that draw from noir. And science fiction, you might think of that as far flung from noir territory. It's not docudrama. It's not about realism. It's this kind of genre of the imagination. And so Blade Runner, I'm dealing with that in terms of architecture, but I'm also talking about it as a neo-noir that's very self-conscious about classical noir and drawing from these archetypes that, kind of pervade cultural memory. And that a lot of the films, well, all the films from the 40s and 50s were not meant to be film noir. That term didn't enter English language discourse until the 70s. Yeah. So, you have these contemporary or semi-contemporary films that are very much aware of film history, very much aware of their film's place in film history. And Blade Runner is certainly one of those, even though it's sci-fi.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I guess most people might not think of, I'm sure there are scholars who would say that if it's sci-fi, it can't be noir. But,
Well, a lot of the critics when it first came out, I think, talked about it as a neo-noir. So it's interesting just in terms of the reception that's kind of how people located it as a film is as this, it's not Star Wars, it's not Han Solo, it's more Sam Spade or something like that.
Yeah. It seems like, though, a lot of sci-fi that it's grounded in a little bit in reality is a little bit moody. And I've always seen, like, Blade Runner is the ultimate moody sci-fi film. And so I've always made that connection. As soon as I saw it, I always thought it was in that same realm. But then you start thinking about other movies like Moon.
Oh, yeah, I love that movie.
It's kind of the same way where it's just long and lingering. And even 2001 might be able to make an argument for that, where it's just like kind of a person on their own, and there's another antagonist.
Can you even, or do you even define noir?
That's the driving question of the course. And I think it's a fascinating question because there seems to be very little consensus over this. Some people call it a genre or a motif, and they define it by like narrative structure or mise en scène or, some sort of politic or ideology or something like that. But my suggestion is, no, it's very difficult to put these clear borders around most genres, any genres maybe, especially noir, especially since these films were not in the 40s and 50s packaged to be received that way. If you read the trade press from the time, they called them murder mysteries, melodramas, thrillers. Nobody in the U.S. was using that term. So I think that's a question I pose to the students almost every discussion is, okay, here are all kinds of exceptions to the rule. Here's how we remember these films, but, here's how they actually play out. Here's how you can see these aesthetics in a range of films that you might never assume would be noir. I think we come up with different conclusions every week. I'm not sure if I want to come up with a definitive conclusion, but it's it's a fascinating question.
So you talked about how the French sort of coined this term and we're talking about it. I know the French are sort of known, at least, back in that era of sort of idolizing American film to some degree.
Exactly.
Is that how it started? Were they just why were they paying attention and no one else was?
Great question. So a lot of auteur criticism from the 50s was invested in noir directors. And actually, Robert Aldrich from Kiss Me Deadly, Otto Preminger, who directed Laura. You guys mentioned Man with a Golden Arm last week. But even earlier than that, in 1946, actually, one of the reasons these films made such an impact on French critics is during World War II, they were not allowed to see Hollywood movies. And so the ban is lifted in 1946 after the occupation. And all of a sudden, during the summer of 1946, they're flooded with all these films that we had gotten over the span of, 5 years or so. And so they're seeing these films back to back, and they're drawing some of those connecting tissues that, American critics may not have noticed since these films were spaced out over, 5-6 years, something like that. And so a lot of them, if you read the French criticism, a lot of them saw these films as sharing a kinship with surrealism, which is very important for French critics at this time. Existentialism, which is also as a philosophical discourse. A lot of French intellectuals very invested in this, and also their own national cinema. Film noir was a term used in reference to the poetic realist cinema in France during the 1930s, and so they saw these films as kind of extensions of some of these crime films and gangster films that they had been making, and they kind of saw these films as a model for their own national cinema. This is how we can kind of revive our own film culture by looking at these directors as models, looking at these films as models. So they love genre films. They love auteur films. They love films with a dynamic style, with a signature style. And so, just as a broad thumbnail sketch, I think that kind of explains to some degree what conditioned that reception after World War II.
So I notice you've got a wide swath of directors represented here. We talked about Ridley Scott, and John Huston did Maltese Falcon, and David Lynch. But you've got guys like Billy Wilder in here as well, and Robert Altman and Anthony Mann. I guess I'm wondering, did every director kind of do a noir in that era? Was it kind of like, okay, now I've done my Western, now I have to do my noir. I've done my comedy, now I have to do my noir. Or was it very a specialized sort of thing?
Well, there's a quote somewhere, and for some reason I can't remember who said it, but I think it's in the Jim Nairmore book somewhere. Pretty much everything on noir is there somewhere. That noir is every director's favorite genre, if you want to call it a genre. And so I think contemporary directors probably, especially directors that are very self-conscious about film history, probably want to take a crack at film noir. But Anthony Mann made a lot of noir films. Nick Ray, who I talked about last time, is a noir director. I couldn't fit him in there, so I'll have to save him for another class. Robert Altman, you wouldn't think of him as a noir director, but he did The Long Goodbye and Kansas City. So, contemporary directors, I think, want to, make films in homage to the films they grew up with. But earlier, I think it was much more kind of, sort of Wild West territory. I think, people just were making these as genre films and kind of, studio projects. A lot of those directors that you just mentioned from the 40s and 50s were studio filmmakers. And so I think they were kind of trying to put a signature on something that was made with a house style, that was, made in the RKO style, or, working within kind of genre conventions of melodrama and the thriller, but trying to kind of, do something more interesting than that. So it's working within the system rather than, outside of the system, like an avant-gardist or an independent filmmaker, maybe even people today.
Yeah.
And I think that's a clear distinction, as Andre Bazin said, it's the genius of the system, as much as it is the director.
Yeah. Well, now I'm sitting here trying to think of did John Ford ever do a noir?
Oh, yeah.
Really? And, Wells obviously did noir. Sure. Touch of Evil is very noir.
The Stranger.
I mean, and there's a lot of stuff in there that, could be considered noir. But even someone like Kurosawa, who kind of idolized the Western directors.
Well, Stray Dog is absolutely kind of a post-war noir, and I love the use of the bombed-out locations there as this kind of haunting, ghostly presence. And again, I think people think of noir as this American phenomenon, which it isn't. Kurosawa made noir films. John Ford, I don't know that he's made a film that we would consider noir the way we understand it in popular culture, but think about The Informer. That has so many of those foggy night shots, low-key lighting, really, at times almost even expressionistic cinematography and mise-en-scène that, why not lump that one in there,
Yeah, that's kind of how I've always seen noir. It's just a style, a look. I've never thought of it as a structure with like the detective. So a lot of the movies that I mentioned earlier obviously don't have a detective, but they have a feeling, and that is
exactly,
and that is one of them. Yeah, I think if you were to make an argument for a John Ford movie, that would be a really good one.
Yeah, I like the idea of noir as a kind of affect or just a kind of cultural sensibility. When you see it. Much like the way pornography is kind of defined by the courts, but you also know it when you feel it too. There's a kind of intangible, embodied reaction that you get from noir. I'm sure you can make that argument with other genres, but
so let's talk more about these elements. We've sort of thrown them out, but let's really talk about them. What are the elements that we would expect to find in what We said we don't have a definition, but the sort of classic idea of what a noir film would be.
Right, the sort of shorthand that people use. And again, as soon as I mention these films, I'm sure listeners will think of all kinds of exceptions, films that don't have any of these things.
Yeah.
But I think the films that stand out in our memories are the ones that we think of as the ones that set the genre. So people typically think of the iconic elements, including the femme fatale or the dangerous woman, the kind of seductive, powerful, maybe even monstrous woman who kind of lures men to their doom, sexually charged. And oftentimes these films are quite hard on women in that they allow them to be these strong, autonomous characters. They allow them to have power over the narrative. And then in the end, they're kind of corrected, quote unquote, or punished, and kind of brought back into their proper place. So the politics in noir is very ambiguous and contradictory in all sorts of interesting ways. So there's that. There's the hard-boiled private eye, the detective. Again, actually, there are more noir films that don't have detectives, but Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, these are the people we think of. Mitchum's character in Out of the Past. You think of the mise-en-scène, the low-key, high-contrast, shadowy lighting. You think of black and white. Paul Schrader says noir has to be in black and white. So, a lot of these movies would not count if we were using his rubric. We nevertheless think of black and white. We think of the fashions from the time period, the snapped brim fedora hats, the suits, the fashions for women. We think of Barbara Stanwyck when she's introduced in that white dress at the beginning of Double Indemnity with the anklet. There's that great moment in Vincent Minnelli's The Bandwagon. I don't know if you guys have seen that musical. It's one of the great musicals. There's an extended ballet sequence called the Girl Hunt Ballet, and it's totally reveling in the fashion and the iconography from noir before we even had the term for it. And I showed that clip in class to talk about how even before there was the term, people sort of still knew there was this sensibility. And I think it comes from as much the fashions as it does the lighting or the directing or the cinematography. We typically think of the kind of corrupt figure of authority, the corrupt lawman, the corrupt political official, people that we're supposed to trust. Think of the villain in LA Confidential as a good example of that. People we're supposed to put our faith in that are supposed to represent the kind of American way of life as being morally ambiguous or thoroughly evil. You think of the gun, you think of the kind of sleazy apartment, the the office late at night, the nightclub, lots of noir spaces. You think of urban spaces. So I think those are broadly some of the big images, at least, that come to mind when you think of noir.
I always think of smoke.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether it be from, sewers or from actual cigarettes.
Cigarettes, yeah. Or fog.
Yeah. I always think of Venetian blinds.
Absolutely.
There's always that shot of like somebody turns on a light and it goes through the Venetian blinds and it has that very specific light pattern of shadow.
I think that's, because you can do such cool things with shadows and light, and Venetian blinds are great toys to play with. I love that moment at the beginning of Chinatown. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie recently, where the guy that Nicholson is talking to, the guy who's hired Nicholson, he's crying because Nicholson has, found that his wife is cheating, and the guy's kind of clawing at the Venetian blinds, and Nicholson says, "Oh, don't ruin the Venetian blinds." So right off the beginning of Chinatown, here's a film that's so self-conscious about Venetian blinds, almost a fetishistic detail like that becomes so self-aware.
Yeah. And then there's that, what is that film? I can't remember the name of it, that Jim Naramore showed last year. It was like a medieval noir. I cannot remember the name of it.
Reign of Terror.
Yes,
yeah,
Reign of Terror.
About the French Revolution.
Yes.
And that's directed by Anthony Mann, who directed Raw Deal and many other great noir films. A great B movie, John Alton's cinematography in that is so dreamlike and so haunting.
Yeah. And just leave it to Jim Naramore to find, the movie that if you described it to someone, they would never think, oh, that must be a noir.
Exactly.
But you watch it and you're like, that is a noir.
Yeah.
Another one he recommended to me was Mildred Pierce,
great
which I
movie.
sort of discovered was it was interesting. And I think I said this when I talked about it. It starts out as a noir, so it starts out as like all shadows, all Venetian blinds and that sort of thing, and it starts out with this murder. And then it switches, and it's like this light, airy. It could almost be like a Leave It to Beaver episode.
Yeah, kind of post-war domestic melodrama.
And then as the story goes on, it sort of gets closer and closer to that end point, because it starts, it shows you the last scene, basically, and then it goes on from there. But just really interesting how it just kind of builds up to like it earns its noirness
back,
almost. Yeah.
I like that reading a lot. It's almost like noir is this virus that has to be eradicated. The film has to police itself, and then it comes back at the end. Well, what are some of your guys' favorite noir films, if I may ask?
Well, like I said, I'd never thought of it as a noir, but Mulholland Drive definitely is one. Let me get my flick chart up, and then I'll tell you exactly what some of my favorite noir movies are.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned a good number of mine, just because I always sense it as a style, a visual sense of what's going on. So they're honestly, I'd say mine are more modern than any others. I would even give an argument. I think even Naramore said that Drive could be
absolutely
argued as a noir film. I mean, that's
very self-conscious about that.
But the one on this list that I definitely would say, well, there's one on this list that is definitely my favorite noir, if it does in fact count as a noir, and I think it does. The Killing.
Oh yeah,
Kubrick's.
Stanley Kubrick's The Killing, which I'm teaching a class in the spring on Hollywood directors of the 50s, and that's how I'm able to get Kubrick back. That was one of the cuts I made here. Killer's Kiss is another great one, which is a bonus feature on the Criterion disc of The Killing. Yeah, I love that.
The other one listed here that we have not talked about is Sweet Smell of Success,
great
which is a very
movie.
Different kind of noir, but very seedy. Almost shocking how much they get away with in that film. So,
and it's that street photography and the jazz. I think there's something about that that takes it into noir territory.
And then they've also got The Harder They Fall on here, which I guess you could make that claim. I mean, but you almost feel like almost any movie with Humphrey Bogart could be counted as a noir.
Yeah.
It's like I've been sitting here trying to think of an argument how Casablanca could be a noir.
Well,
and in some ways it could be.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone would be like start their film class with, all right, we're going to watch Casablanca, and this is the noir section.
But there's something about the ways genres get mapped onto, I think, people's star texts that's hard to disassociate them from that. So Bogart. Yeah. I mean, Andre Bazin has that whole essay on Bogart's face as the kind of character of post-war existential blight. What's more noir than that?
Well, there's that scene in Breathless where the guy is just like staring. He almost worships the poster, and he's like, bogey.
Exactly. And he's doing the thing with his lips. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a movie all about a guy who's modeled himself after the movies, after noir.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we might have covered it. So let's get out of here. Will, good luck with the class.
Thank you. I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
I hope the students are getting into it and turning in good work.
Yeah. We'll see you on Friday.
Yeah. All right. So let's get out of here. Thank you guys for listening. And I'm Andy.
I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.